the observation has been made that Hanukkah always falls out on the weeks that we read the stories of Yosef, or the Parashiyos of Vayeshev, of course, this coming week's Parsha, Miketz, Vayigash, and there's always a presumption that a holiday is related to the Torah readings that are read about the same time. So there must be some connection between the story of Yosef and the story of Hanukkah. And we've explored this from different angles, different times. I'd like to speak about one aspect of the connection. The story of Yosef, the conflict between his brothers and himself, is really a struggle over Malchus, over kingship. As Yosef has dreams where he is the king. In the first dream, everyone is bundling grain, and their bundles bow down to his bundle. In the second dream, the sun and the moon and 11 stars are bowing down to him. And the brothers understand exactly what these dreams mean. And they say, is this going to come to pass? Hamalach timloch aleinu? Are you going to be our king? In Mashoyel Timashel Banu, will you rule over us? And it says that they began to hate him because of his dreams and because of his words, meaning the mere fact that he shared these dreams meant that he was not even embarrassed to say that he had ambitions to be the melech over them. Now the interesting thing is that their objection to Yosef's being a king is not because they were resistant to the idea of kingship. Chazal understand that they had a king. Yehuda was their king. They viewed Yehuda as the king figure. And it was only in the aftermath of the sale of Yosef that they demoted Yehuda. When they realized they'd made a mistake, it's all your fault. If you would have protested, you would have said something, you would have done something, we wouldn't have committed this terrible sin. So after the Mechiras Yosef, after the sale of Yosef, it says, Vayered Yehuda me'es Yachav. The Yehuda descended. Yehuda was demoted, and he removed himself from the company of his brothers. But until that point, he was the king, he was the boss. So really what we're talking about is not a question as to whether there should be a king or whether there shouldn't be a king. And the question was, who should be the king? Should Yosef be the king, or should Yehuda be the king? And the dreams of Yosef were pretensions, at least the brothers held, to Yosef usurping power that rightfully belonged to Yehuda. It's interesting that later in the story, in the end of Parshas Miketz, the beginning of Parshas Vayigash, so we have a encounter between Yehuda and Yosef, and this encounter, the Medrash cites the pasuk in Tehillim, Hinei hamalachim noadu. Behold, the kings have joined. In other words, it was understood that this is a very high-level conflict between kings, and the brothers, if you will, step back. This is Yehuda and Yosef. We're not getting involved in this. We're not getting ourselves into trouble. Hinei hamalachim noadu. Behold, the kings have united. So we're talking about two different visions of kingship. The vision of Yehuda as king versus the vision of Yosef as king.
This actually has always troubled me, that they're referred to as kings, not princes. Their
Kings.
father is alive.
That could be.
Does that imply that he's
could be
dysfunctional?
I mean, we've talked about that as recently as last night. Actually, the idea that Yaakov at this point seems to have withdrawn to a certain extent, and the brothers are playing a much more active role in administering the family enterprise. And we saw that. Chazal point out in the beginning of this week's parasha that Bikesh Yaakov Avinu Leishe B'Shalva. Yaakov wanted to sit in a state of tranquility, and undoubtedly it wasn't because he wanted to relax. He wanted to be free for reflection, study, Avodas Hashem. So he withdrew from the active administration of affairs, And the brothers played more of a role. And the question here is, who should be the dominant figure? And the question is this, that what is the quality of Malchus that the brothers felt that Yehuda had and that Yosef didn't have? What was exactly the issue? What were the two different visions? And we'll explore several possibilities tonight. But let's begin with one point, which is that there's a very curious thing about Malchus. The Zohar says in many places that the attribute of Malchus, of kingship, is les le migar me klum. It has nothing for itself. The fundamental kingship has nothing for itself. Now, this is something which is very important to understand. When the Melech's own position becomes more important than the welfare of the nation, then the Malchus is totally corrupt. We understand that. When it's all about the Melech, when it's all about me, and not about the people, then the nation is in a state of collapse. And again, I'm not going to comment on contemporary politics, even though I'm tempted to, but I don't want to make the video dated. So I'm going to avoid contemporary politics. But you understand the idea. So it comes out an amazing thing, that the greatest disqualification to being a melech is wanting the position. It's the amazing irony. If you want the job, that itself is a disqualification. Now this is a very serious problem in democracies. In other words, who becomes the leader in a democracy? Usually has to be a very ambitious person. If you're not ambitious, you're not going to do what you have to do to run for office and to campaign and to make the deals you have to do to gain the position. But that itself is a disqualification. You want the job, that means you're too ambitious, you're too driven, you're too self-centered. The Torah has a different system. The Torah says, regarding kingship, Som tosim alecha melech, you should place upon yourself a king. Who should you place? Asher yivchar Hashem alekecha bo, the person that God chooses. And Chazal say that a melech, a Jewish king, is appointed al pi novi. He's appointed by the prophet. Meaning the prophet receives the divine communication, and the divine communication names the melech. This is how Shaul HaMelech became king. This is how David HaMelech became king. It was always by the word of the prophet. And the reaction always was a genuine sense of humility, of being undeserving of the honor. Not like presidents who on their inaugural days say, I'm humbled by the fact that I've been elected to this position. I mean, how humbled could they be? They ran for the office for 2 years, if not more. So, and all the campaigning is always an assertion that, I'm the one, I'm the savior, I'm exactly what the country needs, and so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden comes January 20th, and I'm humbled by the choice of the American people. I mean, it's a joke. But here, there was a genuine sense of humility, that the Ribono Shel Olam singled this person out to be the Melech. So we find this is a theme that is repeated in the case of Shaul, in the case of David, the sense of being unworthy of the position. And rightfully so, because to be the king over the Jewish nation is really something which requires a lot of chachma, a lot of wisdom, a lot of virtue. And any person who is worthy of the job would certainly be blessed with this most important midah of humility, as we'd expect. Yehuda, it seems, was not the king because he asserted his prerogative to be the king. Because as we see in the story, that when the brothers had a grievance with him, when the brothers had an accusation that you should have protested, you should have done something, you should have prevented the sale of Yosef, Yehuda was demoted. Meaning Yehuda was not a king because he pushed his way to the top. He was a king by the acclaim of his brothers. So he served at their grace. When they didn't want him, he no longer was the king. Yosef was doing the exact opposite. Because Yosef was claiming for himself that he should be king. Keep in mind that a chalom, a dream, is not necessarily the same thing as a prophecy. This is something we have to know. In other words, a prophecy is a communication from above. A dream may be a divine communication, but it may be just the residue of your thoughts of the day. Because dreams are a very, very interesting thing. Now, the Rambam writes in the Shemaina Prakim that there's a aspect of the human soul called the Chelek HaMedama, called the imagination. Now, during the hours that we're awake, the imagination is subject to the control of the will. So if I were to ask you to imagine a certain object in your mind's eye, you could close your eyes and you can visualize this in your imagination. And that would be essentially your will directing the faculty of imagination. At night, when we're asleep, and the conscious will doesn't function, so the imagination doesn't stop. That's what dreams are. So what do we dream about? If the will isn't directing the imagination, what directs the imagination? Several possibilities. So one possibility is that there is a divine element. Maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, maybe a malach, is actually projecting images on the screen of your imagination. But it may be that what is causing the dream may be an outside stimulus, a loud noise, or something that is left over from your activities of the day, a residue of thoughts. Svarim raised the possibility that things you may have eaten during the day could emit some vapors that would actually influence your mind. However that would work.
Dickens says hard cheese.
But the point is that a dream may be a divine communication, but it may be something which you thought about during the day. The Gemara tells a story that the Roman Caesar asked Yeshiva and Hanania, and apparently there was a threat, tell me what I'm going to dream about tonight. Or else. So how could Yeshiva and Hanania know what the Caesar is going to dream about? So he told him like this. He says, you're going to dream that you're going to be taken captive by the Persians, and they're going to feed you shrotzim, they're going to feed you slimy things on the end of a golden rod, which is such a terribly frightening dream that he thought about it all day, and sure enough, that's what he dreamt about. It was like a self-fulfilling prophecy, self-fulfilling dream. But the idea is that dreams aren't necessarily divine communications. So when Yosef comes and says, I had a dream that I should be the king, so the accusation that this was Yosef's own idea is perfectly reasonable. It's like the famous story which is told. But the Rebbe passed away, and he had two sons. And he didn't appoint a successor. And the question was, who should be the next Rebbe? The older son, the younger son, and the Hasidim were split. Some took the side of the older son, some took the side of the younger son, and there was no resolution. There was a real succession crisis. One day, the younger son comes and says, the whole matter is settled. I had a dream last night that our father came to me and said that I should be the Rebbe. So it's all settled, it's all resolved. Anyway, the other brother, needless to say, didn't think that this dream was reliable. They decided to go to a big paisek, a big Talmud Chacham, to resolve the question. So this Rav said, no, that the dream is not indicative. So what do you mean? He came to me, to the Rebbe. So the Rav says, Das Tav Chalaman the Hasidim. The Hasidim have to have the dream of making you the Rebbe, not that you have to have the dream of becoming the Rebbe. If you have your own dream, it doesn't mean anything. So the accusation was that Yosef was dreaming this up on his own. So, needless to say, the brothers held that itself is a disqualification. I mean, it's not a question of what the ideals are. It isn't a question of what you stand for. It's relevant what you stand for, what your agenda is. The mere fact that you want the job is a disqualification. Because Yehuda isn't king because he wants to be king. We made him king. We forced him to be king. We drafted him to be king. And to the extent that we don't want him, he won't be king anymore, as turned out to be the case. So he's qualified to be king. But you, if you want the job, that itself is a disqualification. So that, I think, is one aspect of the issue, which teaches us the importance of humility, the importance of another in being a king. If you want the job, that itself would be a disqualification. I think there's another aspect over here, which is this. There's a medrash which hints to a very, very fantastic thing. When the brothers saw Yosef coming, remember they were raising the sheep in Shechem, and they moved down to Dosan, and Yosef tracked them down. They said, Hine Baal HaChalomos Hazeba. Behold, the master of dreams, the Baal HaChalomos is here. The Baal HaChalomos is here. Curious expression, Baal HaChalomos. So the Medrash says that what the brother said is that he is going to lead us to the worship of Baal. That's Baal HaChalomos. His dreams are going to lead us to the worship of Baal. Baal, of course, was the generic title for the various idols that were worshipped by the Canaanites. So his dreams will lead us to the worship of Baal. And that's why they felt he was a danger. He was a danger because his vision of kingship, under his watch, if we would give him the job, we would be led to the worship of Baal. And interestingly enough, that's what happened. When you study the course of Jewish history, we know that there was a schism in the Malchus, in the kingdom, after the death of Shlomo HaMelech, and the kingdom was divided between Shlomo's son Rechavam, who ruled over the two tribes of Yehuda and Binyamin, and Yerovam, who was from the tribe of Ephraim, who of course was the son of Yosef, and he ruled over 10 tribes. And Yerovam was the one who introduced idolatry to Eretz Yisrael. Now it spread. It wasn't that the other kingdom was totally innocent, but it started under the watch of Yerovam. The king, who was a descendant of Yosef, introduced idolatry to the Jewish people. And it was true that his vision of kingship led to Baal, led to Avodah Zarah, led to idolatry. The question is, why is that? Why is it that Yehuda's Malchus really should not have led to idolatry, and Yosef's Malchus would lead to idolatry? Even though, ironically, there was a little bit of idolatry that was related to Yehuda's Malchus. Shlomo HaMelech tolerated the idolatry of his wives. He tolerated the idolatry of his wives. But it seems that Shlomo HaMelech himself was innocent. I mean, he was guilty of the crime of indulging his wives, which itself is a crime. Husbands, just don't take that too seriously. But that was his crime. His crime was that he indulged his wives, his foreign wives' desire to practice idolatry. But he himself was not tempted by the idolatry itself. Yerovam, on the other hand, the king of Yosef, it wasn't a question of his wife or foreign influence. He himself had a susceptibility, an attraction to Avodah Zarah. So there's a distinction here between the Malchus of Yehuda. The Malchus of Yehuda doesn't lead to it. The Malchus of Yosef leads to Baal. What is the question? Let's go back. Let's go back to the earliest roots of world history. And this relates to Hanukkah a little bit. Because we know that Noach had 3 sons: Shem, Cham, and Yafes. And the Torah tells the story that Noach, after the flood, planted a vineyard, and he made wine, and he got drunk. And Cham saw his nakedness. He did something very, very terrible to Noach. And Shem and Yafes decided to help Noach. Shem was first and foremost. Yefes came along, and they took a garment, they covered Noach's nakedness, and when Noach came to, and he understood exactly what happened, he cursed Chum, and he blessed Shem and Yefes.
How did he ever realize what happened? Like, who did it?
Well, that detail the Torah doesn't tell us. Maybe there was an investigation, I don't know. But he knew what happened. And again, he blessed Shem and he blessed Yefes. Now, the interesting thing was that the curse of Chum was fairly emphatic. The blessing of Shem was fairly emphatic. Baruch Hashem Elokei Shem, blessed is God, who is the God of Shem. The blessing of Yefes is equivocal. Hashem says, Yaft Elokim Liyefes, which is a hard verse to translate. It may be that God has expanded Yefes. It may be related to the word for beauty, Yofi. God has given beauty to Yefes. V'yishkon ba'olei Shem, and he should dwell in the tents of Shem. So it seems that although Noach is blessing Yefes, he's making it clear that Yefes has a subsidiary position. He is secondary to Shem. That whatever Yefes receives, but its proper place is within the tents of Shem. That's what the verse seems to say. And undoubtedly, it's related to the fact that in this particular episode, it was Shem who was the prime mover. He was the one who took the garment, and Yefes only helped. So therefore, Noach's blessing reflected that. Now, Rosh has a discussion about these three sons, Shem, Chum, and Yefes. And he points out that these aren't just names. That these three sons of Noach correspond to the three basic drives of human beings. And in every human being is a blend of Shem, Chum, and Yefes. It's only a question of the primary emphasis. Shem, the word Shem means name. Now, in Chumash, giving something a name doesn't mean merely arbitrarily assigning a title. Giving a name means to understand something, to understand it deeply, to understand it through and through, and to give it a name which is appropriate for it. And that's what I give a name is. It's something which is a definition, if you will. If you understood the true meaning of the Hebrew names for something, you would be able to know everything about the thing. Now, Balatanya writes in the Shayuchot Ve'amunah that everything that exists in the world we know was created with words. God created the world with 10 maimaros, with 10 statements. And through systems of letter substitution, every statement of God can generate dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of other statements, which in turn created all the things that are subsumed under that statement. So although there's only one general statement that God made to create animal life, since that statement, by substituting letters, changing letters, rearranging letters, can generate hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different statements, every different animal species is a result of one of those statements. And the Balatanya doesn't say it explicitly, but when you delve into his words, you come to the conclusion that he understands that if you would understand the statement, you would understand everything there is to know about that species. Because if you could figure out exactly what statement brought about the creation of the horse, so an analysis of that statement would give you all you need to know about the horse. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Because if the horse was created through a divine utterance, just like you could examine the horse and understand the true meaning of the divine utterance, you could understand the divine utterance and know everything there was to know about a horse. So, assigning names means deep understanding of the reality of things. And that's what shame is. Shame is the person whose name corresponds to the quest for wisdom, the quest for understanding, the quest for chachma. And of course, in our way of thinking, spirituality is very, very, very closely related to chachma. I'm going to come back to this point in a moment. But remember, in our way of thinking, spirituality, true spirituality, is very, very closely related to wisdom and knowledge. The significance of the statement you'll only see in a moment when we talk about Yefes. But from our point of view, that is what true spirituality is. True spirituality is rooted in chachma. Shame, we've covered. Let's turn to cham. The word cham, the word cham in Hebrew means warmth. Warmth. So we're talking about sensual pleasure. This is also a pursuit. People seek warmth. In the summer, they seek cool, air conditioning. But in the winter, they seek warmth. In all seasons, people want to be well fed. They want to be hydrated. They want to have pleasure, etc. That's what chum is all about. Chum is all about pleasure, sensual pleasure. And from the Torah's perspective, the pursuit of pleasure for the sake of pleasure is something that we frown upon. Chum is cursed. A life which is lived for the pursuit of pleasure, the hedonistic life, that's not a life which is well lived. Now let me make a point that I think I've made in the past. On Shabbos, we have a mitzvah of Einig Shabbos. It's a mitzvah to enjoy the Shabbos. So we eat on Shabbos. Sadly, we overeat on Shabbos. Now, the truth is this. The truth is that the Zohar says that Shabbos is Yom Nishmasa. Shabbos is the day of the Neshama. It's the day of the Neshama. So you wonder, if it's really meant to be the day of the Neshama, what is the idea of eating on Shabbos? Now, the answer is that we don't eat on Shabbos to indulge the body. We eat on Shabbos to satisfy the body. What does that mean? Let's keep in mind, Baruch Hashem, we live in a time that we are well fed 7 days a week. But for most of human history, to be able to consume enough calories to be satisfied was the lot of the select few. Because most people were generally hungry. Some were starving, some were just a little hungry. But very few people had really enough to feel satisfied. Most people were perpetually, they were hungry. So they scrimped and saved an entire week, so that one day a week they could be satisfied. Their hunger would not get the best of them. No, it was Shabbos. Shabbos they ate not to stuff themselves like geese. They ate in order that they should be satisfied. Meaning that the hunger of the body should not be a distraction. Should not be a distraction. To the contrary, now they are free for spiritual pursuits. In other words, it's very hard to engage in lofty spiritual things if your stomach is growling. Now, Shabbos, you don't indulge the body, but you satisfy the body. Therefore, now the neshama, without distraction, can engage in spiritual pursuits, study, prayer, and so on and so forth. Now, I said this many times, and I thought perhaps it's a chidush. Last night, by an amazing coincidence, I guess, I had a sefer at my bedside, and I fell asleep to it. There's a sefer from the Rambam's son. The Rambam's son wrote a sefer, Hamaspik L'Ovdei Hashem. And in the sefer, he talks about levels of Shabbos observance. The lowest level, and a higher level, and an even higher level. And he said, on the highest level, there are people that don't eat on Shabbos. So that was kind of mysterious. people don't eat on Shabbos. There's such people. So the editor of the edition wrote in a footnote that undoubtedly what he means is there are people that didn't overeat on Shabbos. That's what he meant. But I understood that the highest level of Shmir Shabbos is not that you. We make a mistake. We think, a regular Shabbos is a Shabbos where I stuff myself. A better Shabbos, like a bigger Shabbos, I really stuff myself. And like the biggest Shabbos, like I really stuff myself. Now that's not the point, right? The higher the Shabbos is, the less I stuff myself. Why? Because the more I understand that really the whole purpose of eating Shabbos is only to be able to relieve my hunger and my distraction, so that I can devote myself to spirituality. So again, a life which is a chum life, which is led just for the gratification of the passions of the body, that's not a life well lived. Accordingly, chum is cursed and shame is blessed. Emphatically. Shame is emphatically blessed. The pursuit of chachma is considered an end in itself, and the pursuit of sensual pleasure is denigrated, and therefore he's emphatically cursed. Because what is yefes? So first there's an amazing thing, that the word yefes, the etymology of the word yefes, comes from the word pitui. The word pitui is to be seduced, to be open to seduction. A gullible person is called a pesi. The pasuk says, "Pesi yamin l'chol dover." A gullible person believes anything, everything. That's what it means to be open. Right? It's related to the word pasuach. Rav Hirsch has an amazing doctrine about the etymology of verbs in Hebrew. All verbs in Hebrew have three-letter roots. So Rav Hirsch understands that when you have verbs that have the first two letters in common and the third letter changes, they're related thematically. So the word paso, which is to seduce, pei, saf, hey, is related to the word pasach, pei, saf, ches, which means to be open. That is, how is a person seduced? A person is seduced because the person is open to influence. If you're open to influence, you can be seduced. You can be persuaded. You can be convinced. So the two are very, very closely related. What yefes is yefes is open. He's open to what? He's open to emotional gratification. He is open to an appreciation of beauty. He is open for emotional experience. And that is something which has its value and has its danger. Let's say beauty. A sense of beauty. To be open to beauty. Not everyone is open to beauty. You take some people to the museum and they're bored. Look at paintings, old paintings, dusty paintings. And there's no interest. They're show me something that is useful, like a car. That thing get excited about. A computer, but something that has no function except to be beautiful. No, they have no interest in that. And there's some people that are open to that type of thing. You take them to the museum, they can sit in front of a painting and their mouth japs open. It's magnificent, such a pleasure. Taking them to the symphony, and they're floating in the seventh heaven. Other people just it doesn't appeal to them. That's what yefes is. Yefes is open to the higher feelings, the higher sentiments of the spirit, of beauty, art, music, literature, poetry, beautiful architecture. And these are the types of things that appeal to a yefes. So, good or bad? Good or bad? So Noach said that the reality is that the interest of yefes is neutral. It's neutral. It depends what it is subservient to. In other words, beauty pageantry can be the maidservant of something lofty. It can be the maidservant of something vile. You know, if you ever had the opportunity to look at the old newsreels that show the pageants that were staged in Nazi Germany, you know, with the ascent of Hitler to power, you know, the pageantry, the regimentation, the pomp. You know, it's easy to see how people could have gotten sucked into this. You know, there was something there. It was exciting, even watching the films in black and white. There's a certain thrill you experience, you know, watching this. I'm sure that the people that were there were mesmerized, and they were mesmerized. It was a known thing. Now here you have this emotional experience used to draw people in to a cause which is barbaric. On the other hand, you know, the Beis Hamikdash was not a shtibel. I hate to shatter any illusions. You know, the Beis Hamikdash was not like, you know, you walk into a dusty shtibel and, you know, they serve the herring and the kichel, you know, for kiddush. It was magnificent. It was beautiful. Right? The Kehanim were dressed in beautiful vestments, elegant and formal, dignified. The music, it wasn't a yidel mit a fiddle. it was something sublime. Right? This was the beauty of Yefes, which found its proper place b'ohalei shame. It found its proper place in the sense of shame. And that was Noach's message. Noach's message was that when Yefes seeks to dominate, when it seeks to see its emotional pleasures as ends in themselves, then there's danger. Right? It has to remain subservient to true value, which is in the sense of shame. Now this is something, let me go back to the comment I made a few moments ago, that to the Jew, in our way of thinking, true spirituality is rooted in wisdom, in knowledge. Beauty, music, art, the aesthetic, can be an accessory to that. But nowadays, I think most people think of spirituality, they don't think of spirituality in terms of wisdom. They think of spirituality in terms of emotional experience. You know, a sense of elevation, a sense of being one with the universe, or whatever that would mean. You know, if you look at Sigmund Freud wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents. In the beginning of the book, he mentions that a friend of his wrote him a letter discussing spirituality, and he said that there are times in his life when he feels at one with the world, and you know, this is a very lofty spiritual experience. And Freud wrote back to him. He says that, I have to be honest with you, I've never felt this experience. You know, he's very cynical about that type of spirituality. But this is something we have to be aware of, that our concept of spirituality is very, very different. That's why, for example, just to illustrate this, that Kabbalah is a big thing. Everyone's into Kabbalah. Everyone wants Kabbalah, mysticism. And what do people want? What are people looking for? Because most people think that Kabbalah is an opportunity for meditation, achieving some higher consciousness, or who knows what. But the truth is, Kabbalah is a rigorous academic study, just like Gemara is, just like Halach is. You know, the people that learn Kabbalah learn it. It's like learning a part of Torah, which requires study and analysis and etc. It's not a system by which your soul floats around in some type of rarefied air. It really is. It's a limud. It's something you learn. You learn. In any case, see, this is what we have. We have over here the various aspects of humanity. The tension between Yisrael and Yavan, which is at the root of the Hanukkah story, must be, at its fundamental base, the recognition of Yisrael that Yavan, by the way, Yavan, of course, I should mention, was one of the grandchildren of Yefes. In other words, Yavan comes from Yefes, and there was no nation which had a greater sense of the aesthetic than the Greeks. Art, and sculpture, and architecture, drama, and so on and so forth. Hellenism, which was the militant campaign to spread Greek culture throughout the world, Klal Yisrael understood was Yefes not in its place. It was a Yefes that was refusing to be subsidiary to the Al Leishem. It wasn't the second fiddle, if you will. It was the tail that was threatening to wag the dog. And therefore, the Kehanim understood, Chashmonoim, Yudah Maccabi, they understood it had to be fought, it had to be resisted. Whereas it wasn't an attempt to simply introduce art and beauty to find a proper place within the scheme of Shem. It really was an attempt to create a society whose primary thrust was the pursuit of beauty, art, Yefes interests, and therefore it had to be resisted. It would have corrupted Klal Yisrael. And that really was the campaign of Hanukkah was all about. In other words, the amazing irony is that, we think of Hanukkah, our thinking is so simplistic. Now, the most simple-minded people think, because they read the newspapers, that Hanukkah was the battle for religious freedom, right? Which is the most wrong-headed way of thinking. It wasn't a battle for religious freedom, it was a battle to prevent religious freedom. It was to firmly maintain the single true faith and not to allow alien values to infiltrate. So those of us with a little more understanding understand that it was a battle to keep Hellenism out of Eretz Yisrael. Why would we want to keep Hellenism out of Eretz Yisrael? We want to keep it out because it's alien, it's foreign, it's antagonistic, it's antithetical to everything that we believe in. That's also a wrong idea. Because the idea is much more subtle. That what Yavan has to offer has a very legitimate place in the scheme of things. It really has a rightful place in the Beis HaMikdash itself. And let me tell you an amazing halacha. And the Gemara says in Maseches Megillah, from this pasuk of Yafta Elokim Leyefes V'Yishkon Ba'al Leishem, the Gemara says that there's only one other language besides Hebrew with which you can write a Sefer Torah that it would be valid, and that's Greek. Which is an amazing thing. That means that if you write a Sefer Torah in English, it's not a valid Sefer Torah. I mean, it's an English translation of the Torah, but it's not a valid Sefer Torah. It doesn't have the holiness of a Sefer Torah. If you write it in Spanish, French, it's a translation. It doesn't have the kedusha, it doesn't have the sanctity of a Sefer Torah. But if you write a Torah in Greek, it has the kedusha of a Sefer Torah. Why is that? Because the pasuk says, that the beauty of Yefes has a place in the tents of Shem. It's an amazing, amazing thing. That means we're not dealing with something which is totally foreign and antithetical and something that is so abhorrent we have to reject it. We're dealing with something that has a place, which really has a place. But it has to be very carefully assimilated Now I'm using the word assimilated in its fundamental meaning. This is another subject I don't want to get started on, which is the corruption of words in languages. Sometimes a word means something and then it acquires a new meaning, which is the exact opposite. So, for example, to assimilate. To assimilate doesn't mean to lose your identity. To assimilate, in its fundamental meaning, means to take something in, to absorb something. Right? If I have a sandwich in front of me and I eat the sandwich, I have assimilated the sandwich. I've taken in the sandwich. It's now a part of me. That's the fundamental meaning of to assimilate. So colloquially, we use to assimilate in the exact opposite way, which is to be assimilated. If I'm swallowed up by somebody else, I was assimilated. We say that I assimilated. Doesn't mean that. I was assimilated. I didn't assimilate. Right? To assimilate fundamentally means to take into myself. If I am swallowed up, I was assimilated by someone else who assimilated me. But since our dictionaries nowadays are not prescriptive, but rather descriptive, so they'll use the word both ways to reflect common usage, which is a long subject about dictionaries. We can talk about that. Should dictionaries direct the language? They merely describe the language. English dictionaries held one way, French dictionaries held a different way. I mean, it's a very complicated subject, but our dictionaries will have both definitions, but in the fundamental sense, to assimilate means to absorb, to take in. We are meant to assimilate Yavan. What Yavan has to offer, we are meant to assimilate. We are meant to incorporate beauty and an appreciation of the aesthetic and emotional experience. We are meant to incorporate these things into our Avodas Hashem, to make them part of the Beis Hamikdash, make them part of the way of Klal Yisrael. At the same time, we have to be very careful to make sure that it retains its proper position in the Ohalei Shein, not to the contrary, that we are assimilated by them. This was the danger, this was the issue that was at the root of the question. And it was one of these issues which was a judgment call. And that's why historically the battle of Hanukkah was not only a battle between Jews and foreigners, it was also a civil war, if you will, among Jews. There were Misyavnim, there were Hellenist Jews, right, who held that it was possible to assimilate Hellenist values and Hellenist practices and Hellenist appreciation and make it part of Judaism. And they may have been onto something, meaning they were ultimately wrong. But it was an error that was rooted in something which is correct, which is that there is a place for the beauty of Yefes Ba'alei Shein. But it has to be very carefully circumscribed, exactly to what extent and in what way and how so. And here, that wasn't the case. Here, the danger was that it would be, again, as I said, it would be the tail wagging the dog and not the dog wagging the tail. Yehuda and Yosef are two poles on this question. We know that when Yaakov Avinu came down to Mitzrayim and he needed to establish a yeshiva, because after all said and done, what's the first thing that you establish when you're beginning a settlement of Jews?
Mikveh.
Even before that? The mikveh is, once you get there, that's the first thing you make. But if you're trying to lay the groundwork before people have even gotten there, right? You send the yeshiva, right? So it says in the pasuk, Yehuda shalach lefanav, Yehuda he sent ahead to the land of Goshen. This is in Parshas V'yigash, when they were coming down to Eretz Yisrael. He sent Yehuda to make a Beis HaTalmud, to make a yeshiva. Yehuda was Rosh. Yehuda was the person he sent. Yeah, it's very interesting. You should know, it's an amazing thing. You take Lakewood today. There's no more vibrant Haredi community in the United States than Lakewood. It's booming. It's booming. You're talking about a city where there probably are several hundred families moving in a month. It's just expanding. But essentially, it's a town that developed around a yeshiva. Monsey, right? What was Monsey going back 60 years ago? Nothing there, right? What was the core of Monsey? Was the yeshiva, Besmet Shalom. It was the beginning of Monsey. When it developed a critical mass, it had a gravitational pull, and more things came, and other people came, and the city developed, and it's booming. But the yeshiva has that power. It might be an idea that maybe someone adventurous in Canada would decide that why do we have to live along Bathurst Street? Maybe we can move a little farther out where the housing is cheaper and make a new city. I don't know. But the point is that a yeshiva can result in the development of a community. So who did Yaakov Avinu send? He sent Yehuda, which means that of all his sons, apparently, what Yaakov saw in Yehuda is that Yehuda was the Rosh Yeshiva. He was the person who lived in the world of ideas, in the world of study, the world of thought. And he had the leadership qualities to establish that yeshiva. It may have been that in other ways Yisachar was more the exemplar of Torah study. We know that Yisachar and Zvulun correspond to Torah study and support the Torah study, but not every person who sits and learns in Kollel is ready to become a Rosh Yeshiva. There's also a leadership requirement. Chazal called the Rosh Yeshiva a Melech. Rosh Yeshiva was a king. There was a question of leadership. So Yehuda had the leadership potential. He was a king, but he was a king in the realm of ideas. Yosef, on the other hand, we find an interesting thing, that what drew people to Yosef was, what quality of Yosef drew people to him? His beauty. It was beauty. In other words, we know that in the blessings that Yaakov gave Yosef, it says that Banos Soada Leshur, that the young girls would stand on the walls to see him, to look at him. In other words, he was almost like a cult figure. People adored him.
An Adonis.
He was so magnificent, and people worshipped the ground he walked on. In other words, he was a person who satisfied everyone's emotional yearnings. And we know that it's true to a certain extent. We'll talk about a political campaign, right? It has been said that once we've entered the television age, a man who is overweight will never become a president of the United States. I would hope that maybe there would be an exception. Maybe Chris Christie could run for office. But the point is that people, who do they want? Who do they want to be their leader? All too often they want the person who will send a tingle down their leg. I mean, that's what they're really yearning for. They're yearning for someone who will inspire, someone who will arouse, someone who will satisfy our deepest yearnings. Now, I think, again, I'll mention a political thing, I think that many people voted for President Obama because it made them feel good about themselves. It made them feel that we are not bigoted, we are open, we're a free society, we're an open society, we're a tolerant society. Here's a man who is unflappable, he's cool, he's saying all the right stuff. Of course, many will say that it was downhill from the inauguration, but the point is that at the time he was running for office, he satisfied some very, very, very deep emotional strivings. In his newest campaign, he's satisfying a different set of emotional strivings, right? There is this feeling that people, they have satisfaction from feeling bitterness and resentment towards people that are better off, towards people that are successful. The 99% against the 1%. And, we're entering a stage of class warfare, which is also very satisfying. It's emotionally satisfying. Right? Will it address the problems of the country? Not at all. Right? There's not even an attempt to address the problems of the country. But and this is the reality. What we really need is we need a melech, so to speak, who will be the paradigm of Yehuda. Not a melech who will be the paradigm of Yosef, if you will. Not a melech who's going to satisfy our emotional strivings, but a melech who's going to satisfy al pi chachma, satisfy the genuine needs of the country. And this is why the vision of Yosef as melech was a vision that was totally rejected by the brothers. The brothers held that Yehuda, who is a melech rooted in chachma, rooted in wisdom, rooted in understanding, was the person that they could count on. Whereas Yosef, he was too beautiful, he was too appealing, he was too emotionally satisfying, right? That would lead Klal Yisrael ultimately to bow. Because the truth is, what is the temptation for Avodah Zarah? Right? The temptation for Avodah Zarah is because it satisfies emotional needs, right? Even though al pi chachma, if you think about it for a moment, you know that it's nothing. That's what Chazal say. Everyone knows that there's really nothing to Avodah Zarah. If you think through it rigorously, you know that there's nothing there. There's nothing there, right? Why do people worship it? Because it appeals to some very, very deep emotional need. Right? That's what Avodah Zarah does, and that's what the brother said, that the malchus of Yosef is going to lead to Baal, and that's why the malchus we need is the malchus of Yehuda. This relates to the question of Hanukkah, because these issues, the issue is what should the paradigm of malchus be? What type of leadership do we need? Really is an issue that came to the fore at the time of Hanukkah. The Rambam says that the Chashmonaim established a kingdom of priests. And this is part of the victory of Hanukkah, that Klal Yisrael achieved a certain level of independence in the aftermath of the successful campaign to drive out the Greeks. But the Ramban tells us it was a failed malchus. It was a failed malchus because they violated the tzavah, they violated the command of Yaakov Avinu that malchus should always be vested in Yehuda. That means that the Hanukkah story, at the same time that it's a celebration, we celebrate the fact that we were successful against our adversaries and we were able to restore the temple and so on and so forth. We all understand that at the end there was something that was amiss. There was something that didn't work out the way it should be, because it was a malchus that did not conform to the guidelines the Yaakov had laid down, that malchus should be vested in Yehuda. And I think that's why the ideas of malchus are things we have to think about Hanukkah. Because what is our vision? What are we hoping to achieve? What are we hoping that Mashiach will be? And the answer is that he's the Melech from Shevet Yehuda. He's the Melech whose wisdom, whose chachma, whose agenda will be compelling, and not simply that he's going to satisfy our emotional needs, for power or nationalism, whatever it is that may inspire us. And these are all themes that relate to Hanukkah, relate to these parshas.